Simcha, celebration, Simcha, Simcha, celebration of life.
Welcome to Simcha, a celebration of life. I'm your host, Eitan Berger. Rabbi Azriel Goldfein grew up in the USA and studied at the Telz Yeshiva under the auspices of many of the rabbis who had survived the Holocaust. He was also a very prominent student of Rabbi Mordechai Gifter. Rabbi Goldfein and his wife Clarice moved to South Africa from the US in 1972. Their mission was to establish an authentic, world-class yeshiva or learning center with the sole purpose of training South African rabbis. This move played a key role in shaping the path of South African Jewry. Inspired by his story, David Sassoon took it upon himself to produce and direct a documentary about the story of this great man.
The yeshiva, the place where he taught, was a little room. You couldn't believe that in that little room he transformed South African Jewry.
The first time I came to the yeshiva, I wasn't that impressed. Then on Friday night, the Rosh Yeshiva came in, clean shaven, no long black coat. I thought, well, what's going on here? Is this a Rosh Yeshiva? Is this a rabbi? That was how my Shabbat began. At the end of Shabbat, I had made up my mind that this is where I was going to come and stay. Because I realized it wasn't about externalities. He was interested in the real Mukwai, the real thing.
He was, committed to teaching, and he believed that if you teach pure and great Torah and you find students, then you'll change the world like that. The conventional wisdom today is you want to change the world, you have to do things in headlines and in large numbers. And he said, you create Talmidim, teach students, and you teach it with pure Torah, then that's going to change the world.
I think for me, when in a great human story, whether it's a great book or a great film or just a great story, is a story about a person that believes in something and follows through on that belief, and with great integrity. And even though it might be a lot easier to compromise, they continue what they believe. It's just for me, I think if you look at most, or for me at least, many great films or many great books, that is the theme of an individual who stands up for what they believe. There's a lot of pressure to compromise. There's a choice at some point in time. Do they go the easy way or do they go the more difficult way? They follow their convictions, and it's difficult. And then eventually, hopefully, there's positive results, and that's kind of the story. And I had a sense that that was the story of Rabbi Goldfein, because here was a person who continued a way of Torah, a way of teaching the Torah from the old world. And if you look at yeshivas around the world today, they're quite different to the way that it was. But he felt that, firstly, he was going to create the first full-time yeshiva in South Africa. Many people at the time thought he was crazy. That included, for example, the boys all stayed in the yeshiva. So there was a yeshiva where they would learn. They would learn in the mornings, the afternoons, and the nights. They would sleep in a dormitory next to the yeshiva. There were meals provided by the yeshiva. And they learned on Sundays in the yeshiva. So these were boys who were 18, 19, 20, who really should be going to university, and they were very clever guys, but here was an opportunity for them to go to yeshiva in South Africa. At the time, most guys were going to yeshivas in America and in Israel. So I think the first idea was just this idea of creating a yeshiva. The second point was the kind of yeshiva that it was. It was really yeshiva from the old world. And he created this yeshiva, and at the beginning there was a lot of resistance. People felt that it would never work, it was too difficult, but he did it. And it was difficult for many years, and he just carried it on in a very quiet way, and eventually he saw great fruits. So I had a sense from speaking to a few people that that was the story, and that really resonated with me. And so I began this project.
Rabbi Goldfein's good friend and former Telz roommate, Rabbi Avraham Tanzer, had moved to Johannesburg, where he had become the principal of the Yeshiva College School.
Of course, it was Ramotl Katz himself who called me over, and he said, look, there is a vacancy now at the Yeshiva. Rabbi Kasovsky has started in Johannesburg, and I think that you and your wife should go. And I said to him, Rosh Yeshiva, You know, we have 3 children. And don't forget, I'm a New Yorker. New Yorkers don't travel. And now you're talking about South Africa. He said to me, they are wonderful Lithuanian Jews. You will love them. He said, and as far as the distance is concerned, he said, if I were to tell you there's a great job in Los Angeles, you probably would consider going. But once you're on the airplane, just keep flying, that's all.
Some years later, Rabbi Tanzer invited Rabbi Goldfein to visit Johannesburg with the view of starting a post-high school yeshiva on the school campus.
He was here for about 11 days. And when he came back, we talked. I remember I had written there, we talked at 3:30 or 4:30 in the morning about everything that had happened, if we should go, if we shouldn't go. And Rebbe Eichenstein told us it is the most wonderful Jewish community. You will love it there.
So if you go back to the 1970s when he first arrived here, I'd say firstly, there were really 2 main issues that were happening. One is that the Jewish community was weakening in terms of numbers. A lot of Jews started to immigrate. There was the Soweto riots of 1976, and there was a lot of immigration of white South Africans from South Africa to other countries, and that included a lot of Jewish South Africans. And the second thing was that, you know, many of the Jews that left Lithuania, they left the shtetls of Lithuania, and they came to South Africa, or they went to America, wherever they went in the world, they generally started weakening in their Jewish faith. They needed to work on Saturdays often, which meant they couldn't keep the Jewish Sabbath the way they would have liked to. And there was a general weakening of Jewish observance. A traditional community, yes, but not a community that was learning and practicing Judaism. So Rabbi Goldfein and other rabbis as well, they, by creating this yeshiva and teaching students at a very high level who went out and are positioned throughout South Africa today, they really rebuilt Jewish observance and faith in South Africa. And today, if you look at the South African Jewish community, there's a lot of learning. The Jewish day schools are full, and it's a community well known around the world that is very committed to Jewish practice. And that's quite a revolutionary thing. And then added onto that, I think the way that Judaism is practiced in South Africa is also quite unique. And when many visiting rabbis from other countries come to South Africa, they remark that in other countries you have a very strong observant community, but it's only one small aspect of the community which doesn't really influence the rest of the community. But if you look at the South African Jewish community, there's a very strong middle ground. It's not a polarized community. There's a lot of harmony between different Jewish people, and he was one of the leading people that helped to achieve that.
Yeshiva Gedola of Johannesburg was one of the first Jewish learning centers established in South Africa. Since its founding in 1973, it has played an important role in the South African religious community and headed by Rosh Yeshiva Rabbi Azriel Goldfein until his death in 2007. The story of Rabbi Goldfein and his impact on South Africa was captured in a documentary called Bridging Worlds.
There's an enormous amount of opposition. People said it would never happen. For example, people said to him, there is no way young men are going to study Torah on Sunday in South Africa. Sunday is a time to get around the pool with your family, to have a braai, and nobody's going to come into a musty building and study old books. And Rosh Yeshiva was absolutely convinced this is what was going to happen.
Slowly, more and more people started coming, and the yeshiva slowly, bit by bit, was built up. I think in those days also financially it was an incredible struggle for the Rosh Yeshiva. He never burdened the students with any of the issues. He always took upon himself the achrayus. That was the big word. The big word is that if you came from Telz, you took responsibility. You accepted it no matter how difficult it was, and you kept yourself focused, and you got on with the job.
Rabbi Goldfein would lead the Yeshiva Gedola for the next 30 years. he would develop scores of students who would fill influential positions across the country and beyond. He founded the yeshiva upon key values that he had gleaned at Telz.
As I started working on this film, I picked up that there was a similarity, in my mind at least, between Rabbi Goldfein's life and my making of the film. And that was that Rabbi Goldfein had a very particular approach to Torah that he had learned in America in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and he continued that approach in South Africa. The Jewish world might have become a little bit more polarized in the intervening years, and it might have changed somewhat, but he felt this was his way, and this was what he was going to teach. He was going to teach what he learned, and he wasn't going to teach what he didn't learn, even if things around him changed. At the same time, he didn't want to create any controversy. And he wasn't a controversial person. He was very into the idea of shalom, of peace, of harmony. And I felt that as I was making this film, this same tension existed within me. On the one hand, I wanted the film to depict exactly who he was. On the other hand, I didn't want to create controversy. And I think it's also probably a theme in my life as well, is this balance between really being who one is and stating who one is, but at the same time not trying to create controversy where it doesn't need to be created, and trying to create a sense of harmony.
My father, he would always speak about the principles he had learned in Telz, under the great Telz Rosh Yeshivas. And he would say the first principle, the greatest principle, was Gadlus b'Torah, the chashivas, the importance, the paramount importance of learning Torah. I remember on my first visit with Rav Gifter, the Telz Rosh Yeshiva, he spoke of my father, and he said about my father, he had never seen anyone work so hard to try to understand a piece of Gemara, a sugya and shas.
And I must say that, I was never disappointed. My expectations were surpassed. We interviewed over 50 people in South Africa, in Israel, and America. They were very long interviews because I didn't really have a fixed idea what I wanted to get out of this process, as I went in very open. The main point that I wanted the main thing that I wanted to achieve was to be true to who he was. I didn't want this to be a fabricated, nice picture of who he was, but really a reflection of who he truly was. And that is the feedback that I've received. That people say that people, I didn't really know Rabbi Goldfein, but people that knew him, I've been so happy when they've said to me, you got him. That's really who he was.
I think an important element of his approach to Torah was his development of ideas from primary source. So he wasn't of the cutting and pasting generation. He wasn't a collector of ideas. He wasn't a trader in second-hand ideas. He was an original thinker whose thoughts were carefully extrapolated and developed from primary source.
He's left behind a yeshiva that his two sons run today that's thriving. He's left behind a school, a very successful school. He's left behind students throughout South Africa and throughout the world that are teaching Torah at a very high level. And he's left behind, I think this for me was that's the last actually comment in the whole film. He's left behind a role model. If you look at the stories in the Bible, they're stories about people. They're stories about Abraham and they're stories about Moses. And we don't only learn from their teachings, we learn from who they were. Abraham invited some people into his tent, and Moses went and he saved an Israelite from the Egyptian. And I just felt that the role model that Rabbi Goldfein was his life, and that's what I tried to show in the film, was the person that he was. We can learn more from who he was even than from his teachings. So my hopes for the film is, obviously for people that knew Rabbi Goldfein, fantastic, and I think for them it's a lovely thing to watch, but even for people that never knew him, maybe they'll watch the film and they'll be inspired in some way. Maybe they'll be inspired to listen to some of his talks, or they'll pick up on something, because it was a great life, it was a wonderful life, it was a wonderful application of the Torah in the world. And hopefully, if people can watch this, Jewish people, non-Jewish people, they can, be inspired by it.
As Jews start to prepare for the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, it is a time to reflect on reconciliation between people and between individuals and God. During this time, there is a heartfelt plea to God that is encapsulated in Jewish prayer. Cantor Ivor Joffe sings some of the special prayers associated with Yom Kippur.
ועל דעת הקהל בשיבה שלמעלה ובישיבה שלמטה אנו מתירין. As we begin the fast of Yom Kippur, the entire congregation gather inside the shul to hear the Kol Nidrei prayer before we begin the Mariv service. I remember singing as part of the shul choir as a young boy on Yom Kippur night, which was often called Kol Nidrei service. And I remember listening to the Chazan in awe of his rendition of Kol Nidrei. You see, Kol Nidrei has a traditional melody, which is well known throughout the world and has been passed down from generation to generation. The Chazan and the choir lead the congregation in singing Kol Nidrei, and the entire congregation recite together in an undertone. This prayer is recited 3 times, and each time is recited with more intensity and more volume. The prayer Selachna is an anonymous prayer of supplication. There are many melodies for this prayer, and this year, as in all the years, I shall be singing with my congregation the melody which I learnt as a child when I was a soloist in the shul choir, and now as the cantor of a shul in Cape Town. I'm privileged to lead my congregation on Yom Kippur and share the melodies that I have learnt from my youth. As I beat the left side of my chest with my right fist, reciting the verses of the Ashamnu prayer in alphabetical order, the congregation repeat each word after me, and a tremendous sense of guilt is felt as we recite how we have betrayed, how we have sinned, and how we have gone astray. The central theme of Yom Kippur, where we ask Hashem for forgiveness. As the cantor, the chazan of the congregation, I recite a special prayer before the Musaf service begins, and this prayer is Hinani. It starts with the words Hinani He'ani Mima'as. Here I stand, impoverished of deeds, with trepidation and with fear, that Hashem should hear my voice, representing the entire congregation. And we ask for forgiveness. We ask that we should be rewarded and inscribed in the Sefer HaChaim, the Book of Life. As the messenger of the community and the congregants, this is a very, very big privilege. And as I stand here, reciting and singing this prayer, I have in mind that I'm representing each and every member of this holy congregation. The prayer ends, Baruch Atah Shomea Tefillah. Hashem, please hear our prayer.
Ki ata shomea tfilat amcha Yisrael berachamim. Baruch atah shomea
Watching this segment on Rabbi Goldfein made me realize how relevant Pirkei Avot, or Ethics of Our Fathers, is today. This week we focus on Rabbi Hillel, who is quoted from chapter 2, verse 4. Do not separate yourself from the community. Do not believe in yourself until the day you die. Do not judge your fellow until you have stood in his place. Do not say something that ought not to be heard, even in the strictest confidence, for ultimately it will be heard. And do not say, when I free myself of my concerns, I will study, for perhaps you will never free yourself. Sadly, that's all we have time for this week's episode of Simcha. Thank you so much for joining us. We love to hear from you, so please find us on Facebook at Spirit Sister Productions and drop us a line. From myself, Eitan Berger, and the whole team here at Simcha, we would like to wish all our Jewish viewers a meaningful Yom Kippur and well over the fast.